But back to China. Its dictator Xi Jinping has scared the world so badly that democracies are now starting to unite against China. I mentioned already how the G7 countries on the weekend criticised China. Now NATO has done the same. NATO is a military alliance of 30 democracies in Europe and North America, and overnight issued its strongest ever criticism of China. Its joint statement accuses China of coercive policies. It says its nuclear ambitions and military aggression present systemic challenges to the rules-based international order. It's a rogue state. I spoke to the director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's Defence Strategy and National Security Program, Michael Shoebridge, who's a former senior intelligence and defence official. I spoke to him a short time ago. Michael Shoebridge, thanks for joining me. Democracies around the world suddenly seemed alarmed by China and are gathering together to do something about it, or at least say something. What's changed?
Well, I think what's changed is China's behaviour and the realisation that the way people have been talking about China has been wrong. So, people have talked about China as a strategic competitor of America's, and in a way that's let people feel like, well, this is all Washington's problem. But the big shift we've seen in that G7 plus meeting in Cornwall is a whole lot of advanced economies leaders and business communities are seeing China as a systemic challenge to them and to other free and open societies. So it wasn't really just a G7 meeting. There was an open societies communique after the meeting, which was signed up to by the whole of the EU, the G7, India, South Korea, and South Africa and Australia. That's 33 democratic countries with about 2.4 billion of the globe's 7.8 billion people, seeing China as a systemic challenge to all of us.
That's rather serious. Now, statements, of course, damning China are one thing, easy things to write. But are the words from the West being backed by action?
I think they are, and there's a growing realisation that some of these big international organisations like the WTO and the WHO are meaningless institutions unless we all invest in them by putting really capable people there and pursuing our collective interests through them. So things like this pandemic and future pandemics, if the WHO isn't reformed and if it doesn't get more transparent and better at preventing and investigating pandemics, we're going to have more of them and they'll be more destructive. And if the World Trade Organization stays as broken as it is now, everybody will be subject to China's coercive use of economics. So it's slow progress, but it's a big shift from where we were 2 years ago.
Now, China is raging in its official media that this is all American plot, and it includes the NATO statement condemning it as well. It says the Europeans aren't really going along with the Americans here, and China doesn't really care anyway. But I'm just wondering, Michael, President Xi Jinping has managed to make an awful lot of powerful enemies, not just outside China, but inside China. It's got enemies and rivals there as well. And I'm just wondering whether they would be now thinking, well, look, can China afford to have a dictator in charge that's making the West unite against China?
I think you're right that this now has to be seen as a global problem that Beijing has. It's not an Indo-Pacific problem. It's not a US problem. It's a global problem. And it's been brought about by the way Xi is ruling China. I mean, to have Xi spoken about in NATO in the same chunk of text as they talk about Vladimir Putin, who is a malignant global leader, that's just not a position that any Chinese leader should want to occupy. So I think there will be concerns inside the Chinese Communist Party, but Xi has been ruthless in jailing or detaining anyone that looks like a rival, and anyone who would speak a criticism like that is going to go straight to his list for being put in front of a people's court.
Well, I don't know whether this is a reflection of some of these tensions. I read last week a report in the Australian suggesting that the pressure may be getting to China's ambassador to Australia. An anonymous diplomats say is no longer going out that much. They say that he's had someone from the embassy even taking notes in a supposedly private chat with an ambassador. They wonder if he's feeling the heat, fearing being perhaps stabbed in the back. How do you read this sort of stuff?
He's in a really difficult position, Ambassador Cheng, because he's really caught between the ship and the wharf. So he's got the Ministry of Foreign Affairs urging him to be a wolf warrior, and that's what Xi wants him to do too. And that's making it very difficult for him to say anything that an Australian audience believes. And then he's got Xi saying, I want you to present China as lovable and humble. Well, these are contradictory directions, and I bet it's giving him a headache. He just has no message that he can give because of that clear contradiction in the directions from Beijing. And I think he knows that that kind of diplomacy is the reason that 33 countries with 2.4 billion of the world's population and about 65% of the world's GDP are pushing back against the kind of China that Xi is making. So I can't say I really feel sympathy for him, but I do see why he's stuck between the ship and the wharf.
I wonder whether there's approaches being made to him, whether he'd like to change sides, but we shall see. I hope I haven't signed his death warrant there. But anyway, Michael Shoebridge, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.